So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Zara Worth is a visual artist and doctoral researcher living and working in Northern England and is currently undertaking a PhD with Leeds Beckett University, UK. Her work proposes connections between online cultures, religious icons, and the work of art through the themes of value, presence, and belief systems. Her latest installation, Think of a Door, is currently being shown as part of the exhibition Sin at York Art Gallery, UK. You can read more about her research in her latest two book chapters, co-authored with fellow artist Dr. Don Woolley, Creative Consumption, Art About Eating on Instagram, in Food Instagram, published with the University of Illinois Press, and God-Shaped Hole in Painting, Photography, and the Digital, Crossing the Borders of the Mediums, published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. Zara, I will turn it over to you now. Welcome.
Thank you, and hello everybody. Well, I'm going to repeat what Amy's just said there a little bit by just saying hi, I'm Zara Worth, and I'm an artist and doctoral researcher at Leeds Beckett University, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you virtually today, and just want to say thanks so much to Amy for inviting me to give this lecture. So today I'm going to talk about my practice-led research, through which I make comparisons between Eastern Orthodox icons and smartphones and social media technologies. So I'll be explaining how, by proposing this analogy between icons and smartphones, and thereby making a comparison between their respective cultures and connotations, we might use their shared metaphoric significance of the forms and compositional features of icons and smartphones to better understand our relationship with Web 2.0 technologies and cultures. Oh. There we go. So before we kind of get stuck in, I just wanted to unpack two key terms that I'll be using throughout this lecture. So firstly, Web 2.0. So this is a term used to describe our current era in the history of the internet. So there are quite wide-ranging debates over when this period, known as Web 2.0, properly began, but usually it's accepted as being around the late 90s and early noughties. Web 2.0 is a period in the internet's history defined by the rise of websites and platforms designed to facilitate the creation of user-generated content. So when people were no longer considered to be passive internet users, but started to create and share their own digital media online. Early examples of typical Web 2.0 sites would be the likes of Wikipedia, YouTube, and MySpace, with more contemporary examples being the likes of TikTok, Instagram, and other meta platforms. And obviously, you know, couldn't mention social media and not mention Facebook and Twitter. So when I talk about Web 2.0 technologies and cultures, I'm thinking about the prevalent, particularly in developed countries, use of these platforms, and most often accessed through apps on smartphones. The rise of Web 2.0 is largely due to the introduction of the smartphone, combined with increasingly widespread stable wireless internet connections, facilitating our increased dependence on handheld devices, which allow us to connect and share our lives through these numerous social media platforms. As an artist, and therefore somebody very much invested in the business of images, Instagram has always been a platform that I've been particularly interested in, as it is a platform which was originally created for the purpose of sharing images. Today, Instagram remains primarily a visual platform, but has now expanded thanks to Facebook's investment and the need to keep up with other platforms like TikTok to include video sharing through Reels, Stories, live broadcasts direct from the user's phones. So when I talk about the technologies of Web 2.0, I'm thinking about both the hardware and the software of today's internet, and in particular, wireless internet access, smartphones, and social media apps like Instagram. While in terms of the culture of Web 2.0, I'm thinking about our relationship to these devices and online spaces. What are the etiquettes of these online communities and communication systems? the behaviours and practices which have evolved as a result of the emergence of these devices and the social media platforms they connect us to. This is also the area which points to what is really at stake in the work, since despite Web 2.0 still being in its relative infancy, it is already entrenched in behavioural expectations. Through my work, I hope to explore how we might be able to understand the significance of this new technology and its associated culture by drawing upon the well-established cultural artefact of the Eastern Orthodox icon. So how do I do this? Well, this brings us to the second term that I'd just like to unpack here, and that is practice-led research. The term practice-led research defines the role of the art practice within the research process by indicating that the art-making process is itself a form of research leading to insights, a kind of thinking through doing. So when I say that my research is practice-led, this is to say that practice is a mode of exploration and experimentation with insights from this process emerging through artworks and in writing, which provides a critical interpretation to help describe the findings of the art practice. And kind of what I'm doing here today as well, kind of interpreting the artwork that I've made through this research process. So whilst the historian's research output might be a book, a practice-led researcher like myself, my research output might be a painting, a sculpture, a film, as well as any kind of other traditional research output formats like journal articles, etc. So in my work, it's been this combination of reading, looking, making, which has driven my work. And I'll explain a little bit more about this process and where the icon fits into it in a moment. So before we dig into the research itself, I'd just like to share with you my own personal connection to Eastern Orthodox icons and specifically Russian Orthodox icons. My connection with Russian Orthodox faith lies through my paternal grandmother, Zara Worth, or to me, Granny. My granny converted to Russian Orthodoxy well before I was born, and it seems that she had progressively worked her way through all other high church denominations until reaching its pinnacle in the Russian Orthodox faith. We have no Russian ancestry and believe it was through a lodger that she was first introduced to Russian Orthodoxy. As I'm sure you can imagine, suitable places for my granny and the rest of her congregation to practice Russian Orthodoxy were few and far between, especially when you live in a small rural town called Congleton in East Cheshire, 21 miles south of Manchester. For a while, it seems that my granny, along with her small and dispersed congregation, were borrowing a Methodist church in Chester for their services. They seem to have muddled along like this for some time until eventually the congregation found this situation unsuitable, and it seems that her lodger proposed that they build a chapel in the back garden. So it's worth pointing out at this point that my granny was by no stretch of the imagination living in some sort of grand house with large grounds. She was living in a very modest semi-detached house at the end of a cul-de-sac. So when my granny and her lodger bought the largest shed available from the nearest hardware store, as you can see, it filled the width of her back garden. And together with their small congregation, they transformed it into what became known as the Garden Chapel of St. Werburg. My granny died when I was 17, and looking back, I can see the profound impact that my indirect experience of her faith and the space that she created to worship had on me. A couple of years ago, I visited the St. Alexander Nevsky Church in Copenhagen, which is the only Russian Orthodox church in the city. I had wondered if visiting the church would transport me back to my granny's chapel, but the grandeur of its interior had no different effect on me than if I was visiting any other beautiful places of worship, such as Durham Cathedral or York Minster. I was struck by the realization that this form of Russian Orthodoxy was not Russian Orthodoxy as I knew it. Such spaces are by their nature very different to the intimacy and the simplicity of the transformation and transcendence of domestic and modest spaces which I had experienced. I remember when I was little and we were visiting my granny's house, the first thing I would want to do would be to go and light candles in the chapel. I'd be told to make sure that I was making a prayer and would be allowed to make my way through the house and down the garden path into the chapel. This journey from pulling up outside the house, walking through the carport, into the hallway, through the sitting room, through the sliding doors into the garden, down the path of very kitsch stepping stones, along which you'd need to lift up and stoop beneath the washing line, which constantly drooped across the garden, before getting to the door of the chapel, had stuck in my mind. It was a passage from the normal everyday world to a secluded, sacred, special space which not everyone could access. My work and research has also been influenced by how this little chapel demarcated space through humble means to create a threshold between the earthly and the sacred. Unlike other churches that I experienced growing up, which at their youngest were Victorian, this little chapel delineated a space for faith and for worship, not in stone built on ambitious earthworks, but by marking out a space with 4 flat-packed walls. Despite this family history, the starting point for my research was actually Web 2.0, not Russian Orthodoxy. During my master's, I began looking at Instagram, and so when I started my PhD, I was thinking about how art practice could reflect and respond to how Web 2.0 technologies and cultures had affected the dynamic between the on and the offline. Use of metaphor and analogy is a recurrent strategy in my work, and I generally rely on metaphor as a way to make sense of things and to articulate meaning and significance. So it didn't seem to me to be a great leap to remark in passing to a supervisor that smartphones and the content of social media platforms were much like Russian Orthodox icons. This originally offhand remark became an avenue for investigation, and I started drawing more and more parallels between the icon and the smartphone. Firstly, both the icon and the smartphone act as mediators between tangible and intangible space. Whilst the icon mediates between the earthly and the divine, the smartphone mediates between the offline and the online. The parallels don't end there. Both are considered to mediate presence. The icon enables the possibility of an encounter between the person venerating the icon through worship and the saintly or divine person depicted in the icon, whilst the smartphone and social media platforms mediate our own presence and the presence of other users. For example, we might talk about having an online presence. Furthermore, the icon, more broadly speaking, gives presence to the presence of an omnipresent God and a coexistent divine plane, whilst the smartphone gives presence to an omnipresent online world. In both these instances, this capacity of these objects to mediate presence is only experienced by those who subscribe to these cultures. An atheist will not experience divine presence through an icon, whilst those who do not engage with Web 2.0 technologies, whether by choice or by circumstance, will not experience the internet as a ubiquitous presence, as it would be unknown to them as religion to an atheist. Both also share the same metaphor to describe their respective convening of the material and the immaterial, as both might be described as thresholds of a kind. Icons are frequently described to act as doors or windows onto the divine, while similar metaphors are used to describe Web 2.0 technologies. For example, during an interview I conducted with the fashion influencer, Kat Atkinson, Atkinson said that she thought of her smartphone as a kind of gateway. Atkinson's evocation of the image of a gateway recalled to me the words of contemporary iconographer Aidan Hart, who, when explaining the purpose of creating an icon, says, "All of this is to create a door between heaven and earth, because an icon is not just a work of art, It is a door so we can meet the Mother of God, meet the Archangel Gabriel in this wonderful event. This metaphor of the door is implicitly discernible in the layers of frames present in each object. In icons, it is common for several painted frames to surround the biblical scene or divine and saintly figures depicted. These frames draw our attention to the importance of the subject, as well as defining a threshold between the divine subject and the surrounding world, our world. Smartphones too possess both digital, decorative, and physical frames of a kind. The bezel on a smartphone is the narrow border which surrounds the digital display. The bezel has a practical function as it increases the structural integrity of the screen. However, it could also be said to delineate a threshold between the digital and the physical, and thereby the offline and the online. There are also numerous digital frames on smartphones, from selfie filters, which introduce glowing augmented reality frames to direct us towards the depicted subject or selfie taker, to digital frames defining the boundaries of an image or video we might be taking via one of the many apps available for image and filmmaking on smartphones, as well as the frames of apps themselves, which open out onto further digital spaces. And it's just occurred to me that right now I'm sitting within a frame within a frame on your own digital screens. Both the smartphone and the icon are also often mounted in elaborate protective frames. Icons can be mounted in oak-clad metal frames, often covered in precious stones and metals, partially covering some or even mostly covering the icon that they contain. Whilst many smartphone users choose to encase their device in practical and attractive, or even sometimes impractical and primarily attractive smartphone cases. Both oak-clad and phone cases reinforce the value of these objects, as well as creating further windows through which to peep in order to encounter parallel intangible worlds. These frames became primary sources for the design of the sculptural component of Portal, an installation I was commissioned to make for the Biennial Art Festival, Linz FMR Art in Digital Contexts and Public Spaces in 2021. I used this Joy to All Who Grieve icon from the British Museum's collection, my own iPhone 11, and screen grabs of Instagram selfie filters of colourful glowing frames as reference images for the development of Portal. Practically, the frames had to be able to stand up, as they could not be suspended from anything, as they would be in a public space, which was unconfirmed at the time that I was developing the work. I kind of developed iterations of the design during a residency at the Atelier House Salzamt in Linz in Austria. And if you ever get a chance to go there, it's absolutely amazing. I would highly recommend a visit. As much as possible, I was wanting to create a form in which these frames would sit within one another, like matryoshka. The sculptural element of Portal also dramatically scaled up the forms that I was borrowing from the icon, iPhone, and Instagram filters, so that the sculpture's frames embodied their shared metaphor of the threshold or doorway. The smallest frames, which echo both the bezel of a smartphone and a digital selfie filter frame, stand at 2 meters in height, around the same height as the average door frame. In my latest installation for York Art Gallery, Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption, which is also the title of my talk today, I worked with a sign manufacturing company to create LED frames which could be suspended from the gallery ceiling so that they appear to stand upright on the gallery floor. These elements of the installation make an even more direct parallel between frames found in icons and frames from Web 2.0 technologies by nesting one frame directly within the other, as well as again explicitly embodying the shared metaphor of the door or threshold. For the first of the two frames featured in the installation, Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption, a red frame in reference to a red painted frame from the icon of St. Andrew the Apostle from, coincidentally, the Museum of Russian Icons collection, sits around a pink frame in the outline of the bezel of an iPhone 13 mini. Since the title of the exhibition that Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption would be featured in was Sin, I wanted to create a piece of work which spoke to the ambiguity of the promises of transcendence offered by social media platforms like Instagram. Whilst when we encounter an icon, we understand that it is a threshold to the divine, it is obviously not the case when with the threshold of the smartphone, prompting the question as to what is being offered by the immaterial online world which lies beyond. The frames are red and pink, glowing and alluring. By pairing the red frame of the icon with a pink frame in the form of an iPhone bezel, the work suggests the promise of transcendence offered by Web 2.0 technologies and cultures. Many phone adverts seem to say to us that by acquiring this or that smartphone, our lives will be better, and therefore we too will be better people. Whilst the colour palette and neon lighting also has connotations of temptation, hinting at pleasures of the flesh and consumerism. So what then lies beyond this threshold? Will Web 2.0 technologies and cultures glorify us or damn us? The work is ambivalent. Sitting on the other side of the pictorial element of Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption is another glowing frame. This time, a glowing blue frame referencing an Instagram augmented reality selfie filter, which encases a glowing yellow frame whose form is based on one of the internal painted frames from an icon of the crucifixion. Again, there is an ambivalence caused by this juxtaposition of frames. Both clearly allude to the idea of these frames representing thresholds or doorways, but what is being promised on the other side? Are we being lured in by vanity, or are we being guided towards the best version of ourselves? Again, the work is ambivalent. In being called to think of a door, as is made explicit in the work's title, it is unclear what is being promised on the other side. Whilst I am making a direct analogy between the icon and Web 2.0 technologies and cultures, and have identified many parallels, as I've set out, both visual and metaphorical, this is not to infer that there is a neat symbolic equivalence between both subjects which can be followed through on every point. Before I talk about creating the pictorial element of Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption, I would like to spend a moment discussing how analogy and metaphor work as a methodology within a practice as research project. It's a tongue twister. Nana Verhoef, Professor of Screen Cultures and Society at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, describes the power of metaphor as a tool for self-reflection, saying, "Self-reflection in media offers insights into how a culture sees itself. That is why it matters." Verhoef goes on to state that by using metaphors as a methodology in research, we are able to, and I quote, specify what is at stake in that moment. In their research, Verhoef draws on a metaphor for the screen, which alludes to navigation, comparing the screens of games consoles, car interfaces, GPS navigation systems, and mobile phone screens to cinematic phantom train rides. Phantom train rides were an early genre in cinema in which the camera was strapped to the front of the train so that the film was propelled forwards along the train tracks as if by an invisible force, hence the use of the word phantom. These films predated narrative cinema as we know it today and were true spectacle at the time, with people even fainting and vomiting in the cinema from the simulation of motion. Verhoef explains the rationale for the cinematic phantom train ride as a metaphor for the contemporary network screen as follows. Both deploy imagery of travel to underscore the new medium, and she's referring here to both cinema and the smartphone, the new medium's capacity as a virtual travel machine. The dynamic of travel as topic, trope, metaphor results in a mirror image when the medium in the image comes to stand for the mobility of the image. When looking for suitable spaces for my installation portal in Linz, my selection of a location in close proximity to the end of a railway line was a nod to Verhoef's research. Portal sat at an intersection between a railway track, roads, cycleways, pavements and pedestrian crossings, just meters from tram lines and with a bridge over the Danube in the distance. The location, combined with the title of the work and its formal allusion to doors and gateways, spoke not just to ideas of transportation and travel, but also the idea of transition and thereby transcendence, segueing neatly onto the analogy the work itself was making between the icon and the smartphone. Metaphor as methodology in practice-led research allows for meaning from seemingly disparate subjects to converge and diffract. The identifiably similar forms found in icons and Web 2.0 hardware and software provide a meeting point of meaning, which in the words of Verhoef, allowed me to identify what is at stake at this moment in the history of Web 2.0. The analogy of the icon and the smartphone and social media manifested by the work tells us of the significance of the influence of Web 2.0 technologies and cultures through its comparison to an object of powerful spiritual significance derived from a centuries-old religious order. Through this analogy, the work tells us to take the influence of technology and the culture of Web 2.0 seriously as something that has the power to shape behaviours and beliefs. More broadly speaking, I'm not the first to make a comparison between religion and Web 2.0 technologies and cultures. Critiquing neoliberalism in the book Psychopolitics, Byung-Chul Han describes the digital as a new order of domination sustained by devotional objects in the form of smartphones and social media. Han says, like is the digital amen. When we click like, we are bowing down to the order of domination. The smartphone is not just an effective surveillance apparatus, it is also a mobile confessional. Facebook is the church, the global synagogue, literally assembly of the digital. While speaking specifically to the marketing of Apple products, Brett T. Robinson identifies the numerous religious connotations implicitly woven into the design and marketing of many Apple products. In Appletopia, Media Technology and the Religious Imagination of Steve Jobs, which I think is one of the best book titles I've ever read, Robinson says, technologies like the iPhone put us in touch with an immense global and decentered network. The scale of this network is only dimly perceivable. It evokes sublime descriptors like Jesus phone because it alludes to something that cannot be shown or presented, where the imagination fails to produce an object to match the concept. It works by referring to the way in which immense telecommunications networks and the devices that harness them exceed our ability to explain their inner workings. The tendency is to fill in the blanks with terms and phrases that signify an excess of meaning or mystery. Adrian Gore also makes a compelling comparison, specifically between the creation of temporary sacred spaces through the processing of icons in what is known as choreographic inscription of space and augmented reality in visual culture. However, neither Gore, Robinson or Han have gone as far as to explore this comparison between the icon and Web 2.0 technologies and culture through art practice. As I've said, analogy and metaphor provide a meeting point for meaning, a point of convergence, but also of diffraction and departure. In looking at recurrent motifs found in icons and Web 2.0 technologies and cultures, I was struck by the number of augmented reality selfie filters with which users could adorn themselves with halos. Clearly, although the form is similar, even a mirror image of the other, there are marked differences. Whilst a halo in an icon denotes the holiness of the figure whose head it surrounds, an Instagram user wishing to add a halo to their own image is by no means inferring that they are a modern-day saint. This brings me to the pictorial element of Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption. I've chosen to share this particular image of this element of the installation, which is during hanging, and it's before the LED lights were installed on either side, just because I think you can see the details of this element of the work far more clearly. As you can see, it's not small. The work is 360 centimeters tall and 280 centimeters wide, and it's made by gilding imitation leaf onto polythene. So for this piece, I gilded both sides of the polythene so that similar motifs from icons, smartphones, and selfie filters were sitting back to back. The forms and motifs I appropriated from numerous sources, including icons from the Museum of Russian Icons online catalogue, Instagram posts from notorious social media scammers like the Tinder swindler, smartphone bezels, selfie filters, and architectural elements from religious spaces. I loosely divided these different references into categories of temptation and redemption, gilding one side with temptation imagery and the other with redemption imagery. The side we are looking at right now is the redemption side, and you can see one half. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but hopefully you can. If not, it's the left-hand side of the image. And that's where you can see one half of Lorenzo Ghiberti's The Gates of Paradise, as well as the vaulted ceiling of York Minster, which, if you can see my cursor, you can see I'm kind of highlighting it here, which is a stunning Gothic cathedral just a stone's throw away from the gallery, which I wanted to reference in the work. You can also see an almost star-shaped mandorla. I'm kind of highlighting, it's in the center of the work. And clapping hands around the bottom of the work, taken from an Instagram GIF, as well as other elements from icons, including the outlines of halos made up of concentric rings of circles and apparently randomly placed large rings, which were both borrowed from a Mother of God, Joy to All Who Grieve icon. This halo, which I've marked out here in red, intersects with a mandorla from another icon from the Museum of Russian Icons collection, the Mother of God of the Burning Bush icon, which I've highlighted here in yellow. In their original contexts, both these forms tell us the figure that we are looking at, the Mother of God, is holy, drawing our attention to the most important figure in the image. They literally circle the most important thing that we should be paying our attention to when we're venerating this icon, and to whom we should be directing our prayers. Slightly harder to see in this image, because it's gilded on the temptation side of the piece, is the third halo in the composition, and this halo is taken from an Instagram selfie filter. So converging these three similar forms and literally entangling them illustrates the analogy, which prompts the consideration of their differences as much as their visual similarities. The selfie taker too is present in its original context to bestow a kind of importance upon the figure depicted, though of course it is not a spiritual significance. Instead, it could be read as being emblematic of the vanity and insecurity exacerbated by the platform, though it could also be read as being a symbol of the platform's promise of the possibility of presenting an ideal self, a perfect version of the superego. In terms of convergence with the halos taken from icons, all these halos stand in as signs for presence. These halos make presence legible. In the icon, they help direct our attention towards a holy presence, picking out for us whose presence we should expect to receive in venerating the icon, whilst the selfie filter halo mediates the presence of the person whose being is detected by the augmented reality filter technology, which tracks the morphology of the subject in order to digitally crown their head. By isolating the halos so that they no longer hover above the heads of either the Mother of God or the selfie taker, the work underscores their mediation of presence through absence. Isolating the halo's forms on the transparent ground of the polythene creates a void space or absence which calls our attention to it. And when planning the work, I intentionally placed the halos so that they would be approximately at head height, so that somebody approaching the work would feel as if they were approaching an absent other, whose presence was marked out by the halos and the other motifs, such as the hand gestures from numerous icons, Instagram GIFs and posts, which point towards a seemingly absent central figure. In doing so, once again, the icon and Web 2.0 technologies and cultures converge, not in terms of the significance of the being whose presence they draw our attention to, but through the mechanisms by which this presence is communicated. I would argue that Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption shows how both the icon and Web 2.0 technologies and cultures communicate absence through presence by weaving together elements appropriated from each subject that usually act as types of framing devices. With this in mind, let us return to the sculptural elements of Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption, since as well as being thresholds, they are also frames. These frames too affect the presence of absence, since they frame nothing. I went to great lengths to really stress this to the sign manufacturers that I worked with to make the frames, to make sure that they understood that people actually needed to be able to step through these frames, not so that there wouldn't be kind of a massive sheet of perspex that you were looking through, so that they really did embody their metaphor of the doorway. And again, as with the halos, the scale and positioning was key to recalling a sense of presence through the demarcation of a space within which a body could be framed. I had previously experimented with the arrangement and positioning of frames in 2 iterations of Portal. In Linz, the 3 frames which made up the sculptural element of the work were installed with the bottom edge of the frames fixed directly to the ground, though this was obviously for practical reasons associated with working in a public space where health and safety as well as security needed to be taken into consideration. The location of the work drew out its capacity as a framing device, since it could frame various views depending on which side it was approached from, and passers-by would be enticed by the work's frames to explore its voids, stepping through to take photos of and with the work. Being fixed to the ground and in a public space, and therefore freed from the etiquette of an art gallery, definitely made the public more confident about interacting with the work. In the second iteration of Portal at Newcastle Contemporary, I was mostly concerned with hanging the pictorial elements of the work from Portal so that the imagery was more visible than when it had been draped over the sculptural frames in Austria. For this installation, I didn't have the original frames to work with and introduced 2 new sculptural elements into dialogue with the pictorial elements. This included a suspended pink frame, and this frame was the same scale as the one in Austria, but much lighter and suitable for suspension from the ceiling using a transparent line so that it appeared to hover above the ground. Although this was very striking visually, especially when viewed through the transparent gilded elements, the manner of its installation, combined with being in a very large white cube-style gallery space, definitely affected people's confidence in interacting with the work. The frame was clearly fragile, so people felt less able to step through it. Also, the gallery itself, as it was so large, didn't feel to be an inviting space for people to want to take photos with the work in the same way as they had done with Linz. Therefore, it felt really important that when I came to make Think of a Door, Temptation, Redemption, that the frames should stand so that they were touching the gallery floor. One of the most exciting things about the installation has been seeing how people have interacted with the work, both on and offline. People queue up to get their photos taken with the work. which brings me on to another point of convergence between the icon and Web 2.0 technologies and cultures revealed by the artwork, as it shows how both are, in their own ways, prompts for participation. For those who use icons as part of their religious practices, icons have clearly defined ways of engaging with them, both physically and mentally. People might kiss an icon, light a candle in front of it, just as I used to do as a child, and may mentally adopt a reflective and meditative mindset when encountering an icon, which I have to say, although I never probably achieved when I was a child, I certainly remember sort of trying to go into the chapel with a solemn frame of mind and adopting a demeanor of reverence whenever I went in to light candles. The hardware and software of social media too has its own expected behaviours, from the practical operating gestures specific to the smartphone, such as swiping and the swift double tap, to the expected reactions and responses to content shared by others, such as liking, commenting and following other users and their content. In drawing people in and provoking the desire to take pictures of and with the work, Think of a Door, Temptation Redemption embodies how both the icon and Web 2.0 are prompts for participation, though participation to different ends. In this way, the work is also quite subversive, as it lures people to behave in ways against the grain of the traditional etiquette of the gallery space, as it was not that long ago when it was not permitted at all in galleries in the UK for people to take photographs, and it is still forbidden in most galleries for people to take photographs using the flash feature. It's been hugely exciting to see people's creativity in their interactions with the installation and the role of smartphones in these interactions. The work demonstrates the impact that Web 2.0 technologies and cultures have had on people's interactions with works of art. Through social media, I've been able to track people's engagement with the work in ways not previously possible. I love, for example, in this central image, seeing how this user has used the installation to frame other artworks in the exhibition, as well as seeing just generally how joyful and creative people's interactions with the work are as they make their own images with it. In this way, the work continues to have a life of its own. Just as I used extant images to make images, the images that I have made now bear further images. This analogy between the icon and Web 2.0 technologies set up through the composition of Think of a Door, Temptation Redemption also reveals the lively and unpredictable lives of images in the Web 2.0 era. From this convergence of meaning through the analogy made between the icon and Web 2.0 by the artwork comes diffraction of meaning, leading to new insights. All this engagement online with the work, led by Web 2.0 technologies and cultures, embodies filmmaker, artist and writer Hito Steyerl's description of the agency of images in today's culture. In the essay, Too Much World, Is the Internet Dead? Steyerl says, by walking off screen, images are twisted, dilapidated, incorporated and reshuffled. They miss their targets, misunderstand their purpose, get shapes and colours wrong. They walk through, fall off and fade back into screens. Think of a Door, Temptation Redemption encapsulates this relation between the on and offline in the lives of images today. To create the work, I extracted elements from numerous images, many of which I found online just as I was searching through the Museum of Russian Icons online catalogue. Even aspects from the work that reference spaces and objects I did observe in real life, such as the interior of York Minster and a medieval lintel to a jail cell, were at first digitised as I took photos on my own smartphone for reference later in the studio. I made drawings on tracing paper from these images, isolating elements such as frames, halos, hand gestures, which in their original sources were intended to focus our attention on the presence of a particular subject. And in doing so, I had, in Steyerl's words, compressed, reproduced, ripped, remixed, as well as copied and pasted these images into other channels of distribution. This sketch of the remixed images provided the foundation for the final composition, which I translated onto polythene with the imitation gold leaf. I'd intentionally made this installation with the idea that it would demarcate spaces that people would be drawn towards and want to inhabit, just like the little chapel at the bottom of my granny's garden, and I'd hoped that it would prompt what I had anticipated, for people to want to take photos of and with the work. However, I really experienced the agency of images and their demand to be made when I was asked to go in to have my photo taken with the work ahead of the exhibition opening. I actually hate having my photo taken, which I appreciate is quite ironic when I make work about selfie filters. So I was relieved when there was 2 professional photographers present to take over and tell me exactly what to do, how to stand. It was like I suddenly didn't know how to use my limbs. I had to be told like how to move my feet and where to put my hands, etc. It became quite an informative experience about the work itself, as through the photographers, the work dictated a relationship with it, demanding certain movements and positions to be held. It invited and directed the creation of more and more images of itself. After having worked very intensely on the work in the lead up to the exhibition, I was overwhelmed by the sense that these images had their own agency. In the words of Stael, they were images to be participated in, and in that moment I was participating in the images and in the creation of further images. Last year, I attended an icon making course, and during the course, I created a Christ the Pantocrator icon, and it was explained to us how it was important that the ego of the artist creating the image should be absent in order for the prototype of the image to come through as the hand or kind of the presence of the spirit actually kind of came through us. We were sort of channels for the Holy Spirit in order to create these images. In a very different way, in the gallery, having photos taken, I too felt absent from the artwork now that it was installed in the space of the gallery. The images that had wandered off screen into my artwork were now multiplying beyond my control and wandering back onto screens as people took and shared more and more images. One of the elements of the work, which I haven't touched upon until now, are 3 holes cut into the polythene within 2 of the rings referencing a Joy to All Who Grieve icon and a decorative ring from Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise. These holes represented the possibility of slippage between the on and off line, bringing us back to the idea of the threshold. Because a threshold is not a closed boundary, it is a porous one. And as the compositions of icons so often go to lengths to remind us, tangible and intangible spaces, be they divine or digital and earthly or offline, are entangled and capable of seeping into and influencing the other. Thank you. And that's all for today from me. I hope you've enjoyed that. And I hope you've got questions.
Zara, thank you. Yes, so if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A or the chat if that's easier for you. I can keep an eye on both. This was fascinating. First and foremost, I have to say your installations are beautiful. They're very, very engaging. And, you know, I was wondering, as I was thinking about, you know, what this lecture might be like if you were going to reference Aidan Hart, because of course the UK is really the most prominent iconographer in the UK right now. And his research is really innovative, and what he's doing with icons is really quite remarkable. And he did a lecture for us not that long ago in conjunction with our contemporary icon exhibition. And these were all icons that were painted this year or within the last couple of years. And just, you know, this idea of what is the role of the icon in modern society. You know, I think sometimes people struggle with finding, or with, you know, they don't find icons necessarily relevant for the modern world. And the work that, you know, people like Aidan Hart and what you are doing right here really shatters that notion. You know, yes, these are ancient objects, but they're applicable, and the ideas surrounding them are applicable to the world that we're living in right now. And just sort of all these concepts that iconographers and scholars are struggling with around icons, this idea of ritual and originality. That's what we're struggling with understanding this Web 2.0 world, right? And Instagram and what does it all mean? I'm curious, as far as your research goes, what's next? As we think about, the metaverse, and what is the world going to look like in another 20, 30 years as technology advances? And then, what is the role of the icon in that? Are we going to have digital icons within icons? It's kind of scary to think about in a way.
Yeah, no, completely. And actually, one of the things that, I'm not sure how much I'm going to kind of look at it immediately, but one of the things that I've been really fascinated by is Meta launching, I've lost the name of it in my head, but they're launching this platform which is all about presence, and that it's this virtual reality platform that they're kind of foregrounding, and this idea that we'll all have kind of virtual reality avatars, and I know that they got really made fun of kind of how low resolution and low kind of quality a lot of their avatars were. But what I found really striking was how in kind of the press and advertising, where Zuckerberg was trying to get people excited, he was really making huge promises about the experience of presence that was going to be offered by this technology. And I just found that really interesting, because I thought it just really revealed the extent to which that presence is something that we innately desire, yearn for. And I suppose, this is where, again, I think it's really useful to think about the icon, because it in the same sort of way, it's this desire to feel connected to this sort of omnipresent community, which obviously the icon is kind of connecting us to God and to the divine, and that is in itself a kind of like holy, hugely networked immaterial community of a kind. And obviously in a very different way, Zuckerberg's trying to offer this connection to this massive network, and offering us kind of the presence of that network, but also this idea that we can experience the presence of our friends and loved ones through these devices. But I think that's kind of a longer term. I think the technology itself needs to kind of work out what it wants to do. Right now, though, I'm working on something on a very, very different scale. I'm actually, very recently, I've just visited the V&A to visit the National Art Library. And there they have this amazing collection of, they're called paper peep shows. It sounds a little bit more exciting than it is. They're just these actually very prim and proper little tiny Victorian, I suppose you would call them books, but there's no text. And they are essentially images. Think of like an accordion of paper, and you kind of place them on a flat surface, and there'll be a peep hole in the top piece of paper, and then you look through, and because there's this sort of accordion of different sort of frames that sit below it, you get a scene. And that there's quite a few that are of the Crystal Palace, and there's actually quite a few which are, interestingly enough, of churches. And I'm really interested in how that as a form could be kind of transferred onto this ongoing project of mine, thinking about kind of smartphones and icons and their frames, because as a form, it's all about kind of creating the illusion of perspective, and more broadly speaking, therefore, creating the illusion of space within a space. And I think there's also something quite magical about this sort of unfurling of this seemingly non-existent, hidden inner world, which is, again, kind of, I feel like lends itself to both the icon and a smartphone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And going back to your comment about what Zuckerberg's trying to do with Meta and creating connection. And then we have kind of the opposite of that happening right now with Twitter and Elon Musk's takeover. And you see this mass exodus of Twitter users, which, normally, you're connected to someone on Twitter in real time. That's for a long time. That's how people were getting breaking news. And then you sort of have these sanctions being put on the platform. And it's totally changing the dynamic and breaking connections that people have. And you kind of have to pay to play now, which is just wild.
Yeah, and I think it really shows the extent to which in such a relatively short period of time there was such clear expectations sort of associated with the platform, which now those have been broken. It has destabilized this sort of entire ecosystem and culture. But also Twitter just generally is interesting because it really demonstrates the influence, as I'm sure you're aware, in the US, that platforms it can have.
Too familiar here.
So yeah, I think I can still remember being asked when I started my MA, do you really think that like platforms like Instagram are really a valid topic for research? And I was like, it's 500 million active daily users. How can it not be important to think about? How can it not be considered to be influential?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, there's a great question in the Q&A that I do want to get to, but I'm curious, just one more question from me, if you've looked into Twitch at all, and sort of the idea of the streamer and content creator as icon.
No, I haven't actually. That's an interesting kind of food for thought for the future, definitely. I don't game, so that's probably why I've not really gone there. But there is something again about those nested images where you've got kind of a digital world in which the kind of image of the streaming Twitcher is nested within the digital world. It's an interesting layering that goes on there. Great. Definitely similarities in terms of form.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we do have an audience question. So is part of your research that the Orthodox traditional icon is the absence of ego/self, and the Web 2.0 icon is the very presence of ego and human creativity?
So I think, yes, that the icon in its ideal form is the absence of ego and self, because in its sort of true form, it should be the kind of Holy Spirit coming through the image of the icon that kind of brings the image forth. And then, so do you mind repeating the wording of the second part of the question about?
Oh, sure. So the whole question again is part of your research that the Orthodox traditional icon is the absence of ego and self, and the Web 2.0 icon is the very presence of ego and human creativity.
I'm not sure it is. No, probably not, because I don't think that it is the kind of very presence of ego, because I think that I think that it gives the illusion of individualism, but it's not. It kind of gives the illusion of you being able to do something really subjective and really that's kind of specific to you as an individual, but it's not, because it's borrowing existing forms, as we've seen with like kind of the halo, etc. But also like it's kind of like a paint by numbers approach. It gives the illusion of choice in what you can present, but also it just very quickly sort of pushes people into these silos in terms of the kind of cultures and communities that they end up drawn towards, so that you end up in these communities where you're all doing the same thing. All of the Instagram or Twitter feeds that you're interacting with are saying the same thing, or you're just sort of shouting at each other about the same thing. I think that there's still another absence, or I suppose one of the things that I find quite interesting about it is not so much actually the individual user, but also the kind of nihilism of it all, the pointlessness of it all, that it is quite kind of, meaningless in some way, and that this idea, so thinking specifically about this notion of presence communicated through digital devices, there's this loss that occurs to me, so maybe not meaningless, but certainly like this massive loss that's underscored by it kind of works by reaffirming absence, is I suppose what I'm trying to say. I think that maybe as a good example is like having a video call with a friend during the pandemic. I've experienced this really profoundly. You would have this illusion of presence mediated by the device, but then the phone call ends, and I always just felt this profound sense of loss where actually what was sort of the reveal was actually absence. This person is not there. It was just an illusion of presence. It wasn't actually presence. I suppose that's probably a very, very bad answer. But
I think it makes sense, because I was thinking about, when things started reopening again here in the States, I had lunch with one of my colleagues who I hadn't physically seen in close to 2 years. And, she and I were saying, but it feels like I've seen you, because we attended a lot of the same Zoom programs and, networking things and that type of thing, but it wasn't real in a way, yes, we were both really attending those events, but the interaction, I don't know, it just, the interaction that you have online, it doesn't seem lasting, or maybe it seems inauthentic in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's something, I suppose it's funny because we're talking. I wouldn't be able to be with you. I wouldn't be able to be with you if it wasn't for this technology. But I suppose it's that it's in lieu of the real thing, which I suppose, again, the icon is in lieu of the real thing. The icon isn't pretending to be, you're not actually worshipping, that it's a piece of wood. That's what I'm trying to say. Just as that the phone is just a load of plastic, glass and metal, but you're kind of participating knowingly, or maybe it's becomes so fluent that it is not knowing anymore, it's just sort of inherent. You're participating in this sort of shared illusion of presence, but then you cease to participate in that and the illusion drops and you're just back in your living room. I remember that I had my hen party had to be on Zoom. That was like a cancelled hen party ahead of my postponed wedding because of COVID. And it was really nice. I had all of my friends together in this room, but then it ended, can kind of go on the entire night, and it just being really sad and just feeling again this sort of sense of loss that I wasn't with those people.
It's, I don't know, it's just strange to think about, I guess, the lasting impact of all of this too. And how it shapes our interactions moving forward, whether it is in this sort of virtual space or in physical real life. And I guess, thinking about the smartphone and the icon, yes, we know they're just either bits of plastic or wood, but I guess it's really more what they represent.
I think that's
representing
where
something much bigger than
but I think that's where their importance is that it indicates the importance of these sort of, they become these sort of almost universal narratives, or I think they're kind of, they speak to the human condition almost, like this need for presence, this need for proximity, this need for a promise of the possibility of transcendence in some way, and that these objects become part of that narrative, that kind of, that condition of being.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. I do see someone has their hand raised. So if you do have a question and you want to type it into the chat or Q&A, feel free to do so. But otherwise, I think we'll wrap it up here. Zara, thank you so much again. And thank you everyone who tuned in today. And we look forward to hearing more of your research and more, keep me posted on your, upcoming installations and all of that. And good luck with your doctoral work.
Thank you. And thanks so much for having me today. It's been lovely.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.